Hello, I'm Juliette Foster and I'm delighted to welcome you to X-Bank, the home of the Future Bank, where we discuss digital transformation minus the hot air. There's a bit too much of that around these days. Today we're going to be looking at how to create proactive, seamless and customer-led service and ultimately take the banking customer experience up a notch or several. I can't do it alone, but I'm delighted to say that I'm joined by an excellent panel of experts. Let's meet them. First up, we've got Fergus Murphy, who's the Group Chief Customer Experience Officer at Virgin Money. Good to see you, Fergus.
Thank you.
Followed by Matthew Harwood. Now, he's the Head of Customer Messaging at NatWest. Good to see you. And just to confuse you, we have another Matthew, but we're going to call this one Matt. He's Matt Hopgood, who's the Global Vice President of Experience at Publicis Sapient. It's good to see you. OK, so there's a lot of ground to cover. Let's dive in. So it's a question to all of you, but we'll start first with you, Fergus, and then we'll move our way around. But look, it's the end goal. It's a very profound question, really. But in your opinion, what do you think it is that customers will come to expect from their banks in 5 years' time?
It's a great question, Juliet. I think that customers will expect a bank in their pocket. I think the mobile phone and the way we interact with our customers through the mobile phone will really be where it's at, and customers will expect everything, anytime, anywhere, any place through the mobile phone for their banking.
OK, so Matthew, a bank in the pocket. Do you agree with that?
I think there's very much that direction of travel, but it does need that support of a human touch to go alongside it. And I think it, to an extent, where we say bank in the pocket, that in 5 years' time, what a bank is probably quite different from an experience perspective. So it'll be widening out to those needs that are on the fringes today and tuck them in. So how do you intersect, if you were talking mortgages, your paperwork with your solicitor? Is there opportunities to create one experience through that process, not what traditionally is that isolated banking as we would see it today?
OK, and Matt?
Building on both answers, absolutely banking pocket, and absolutely it's important that we don't forget the discretionary decision making that colleagues make in the front line and the humanity and the warmth they can bring. But I think customers are also beginning increasingly to care more about the values of an organisation and how those values reflect on their own expectations and sensibilities. And so I think it's really important that as the banks begin to think of the experiences that they can create, they're also thinking about that wider societal impact and how they can partner to make better impact there.
OK, stay with me on this one, Matt, because look, what we're talking about is everything which comes together seamlessly. But from your perspective, what does a truly proactive, seamless and customer-led journey actually look like?
Yeah, it's interesting. I think people, they often begin to obsess around features and functions and, who's got what pot, what's the space, how can we put that into our experience? And I think that will also always increasingly be true. But banks are getting more agile. And so, the ability of the banks to keep pace with those types of innovations in the experience layer is we can see evidence of that in response to the COVID pandemic and how everybody updated their experiences within days, not weeks or months. And so I think that for me, it really comes back more enjoyingly to service values, which is this idea about know me and reflect what you know about me in that experience. Remember me, which is make sure that those contact moments are consistent across touchpoint and channel and over time, and act on my behalf, which is give me good advice and make sure that your recommendations and advice are tailored towards my needs. And I think that any experiences of the future that can begin to more consistently exemplify those service values, that's really where the banks need to be striving for more consistency.
And it's a good vision, obviously one that's very important, Fergus, because the bottom line is that if you tick all the right boxes, you keep your customers on board. But when it comes to that digital customer experience, what have the most exciting developments been that you have seen that, in your opinion, they're really expressing those sentiments that we heard there from Matt?
Sure, and it's probably building on what Matt was saying, and I think it's really open banking and APIs and application programming interfaces where, companies, banks can import and export services, data in a really seamless way to bring together a joined up customer journey, because banking is the artery of capitalist economies. But at the same time, it's not tactile. So if you're a beautiful, making beautiful furniture or clothes or sandwiches or whatever it is, you can see it, you can touch it, it's tactile. Banking has become extremely utilitarian, extremely commoditized. And so you're trying to elevate banking more to what the customer outcome should be, not that you're selling a loan or a deposit or whatever. You're trying to make it part of a seamless part of the customer's life. And that banking as the artery to so many things that we do, rightly or wrongly, it's probably the least worst way of running an economy, a capitalist economy. It allows the customer that freedom to look at their lives. And that's what I think we need to do with banking, try to make it more experiential. Because at the moment, for example, if you want to open a current account in the UK, a bank offers the customer cash. Please come into our bank, we'll give you money to open the account. And of course there are specials in every industry and promotions, but it seems quite lowbrow. And I think we're trying to make banking a little bit more experiential. We know that people value experiences over cognitive things, spreadsheets, numbers, and trying to bring banking alive again. And that's a difficult thing to do because after the financial crisis, banks were, had so much of the blame for that, trying to bring banking back to a good status in terms of society and economy, and that's the challenge we have.
And that's interesting, isn't it, Matthew? It's basically making banking sexy, if you like, relevant to us, because it's as natural to all of us as going out to the store to buy your groceries. But look, it also points back to this idea of self-service. Now, why is it such a hot topic at the moment? And what do you see as the motivating drivers behind it?
I think if you look at how the world's evolved recently, is people can do whatever they want in their day and lives outside of banking. And it's just that it needs to be a continuation of, well, why can't I do it in that way? And why do I have to come and do that for you? And because of the way some of the regulations and rules are wrapped around banks today, that has to fall through. So it's how do you work with the regulators to discuss that? But then you also look at some of the new evolving ones. So Fergus, to your point on those seamless experiences and how do you bring them up, you look at the buy now, pay later, where that came from. That was making online shopping seamless. And now we're discussing, well, has that gone too far from a frictionless perspective? And how do we make that safe and secure for the clients and customers at the end of the day, as opposed to it being, it's so easy that we just go away and do it. So it's that balance of self-serve with positive friction. But obviously, for something like I want to change my address, why do I need to call you? Why do I need to go into a branch to do that when, to an extent, you're my bank? You should know that anyway. So it's how do we understand that trade-off and intersect between the various experiences we need to create, want to create, and where we can make them as seamless as they could be or not. And that's through active choice to keep people safe.
I mean, let's broaden things out a bit, and I want to throw this question to all of you, but Fergus, you get the first dibs on this one, because, I mean, look, there are so many advances in digital self-service. What are they? What are the ones which have really stood out for you? And again, just standing out because they're examples of really successful use cases, because we can talk about how we have this vision of what it is. Very difficult to translate, but who's getting close or has got close already?
I think a lot of banks and non-banks and what we call neobanks and traditional banks have got close on lots of different things to a very good service, a lot more to do. But you start with the really simple things, like why do people go into branches in the past and queue up literally outside the door of a branch in the past to change their address? They have a problem getting into an account, they want to deposit a cheque, they want to deposit cash. And of course, most banks now, for example, have a very, very seamless, very easy check scanning piece of functionality within their app, within the mobile phone. And so there's so many simple things that customers now can do within an app or online that in the past they would have had to go to a bank, get a bus, queue up, whatever. And we all can remember, queues in banks, and indeed they're still there sometimes.
Well, I was going to say, I still see them in my bank.
Yep, they're still there at times. That is fair, and that means there's an awful lot more to do, right? But the ability for the customer to manage their everyday banking while they're in a bus or walking down the road, although try to keep your eyes ahead so that you don't bump into something, is quite strong now. And I would just really talk about those simple everyday things like being able to change your address and scan a check and that type, send money to your daughter or your brother or your sister. These are the things that cause the most friction or the things that most banks can now deliver seamlessly.
Matt?
I think recently what's been really exciting is where the banks have been recognising and embracing the front-to-back nature of customer experience. And so we're changing this view that customer experience was perhaps traditionally viewed as just the bit that the customer saw, you know, the channels, the products, the marketing, the brand, the touch points where that bank engaged with the customer. And of course, that isn't entirely true. You know, to build on your point, Matthew, it's also about the regulatory constraints, the policies, the risk appetite, all of those business processes. And I think where I've seen some self-serve work wonderfully well, and I come back to the, you know, the context of the pandemic, is that, you know, within days of that first furlough hitting, virtually all of the banks had, you know, made adaptations to their digital experiences, which allowed people to apply for payment holidays on their mortgages. A few of the banks managed to do that as a straight-through process. So it wasn't just about a form which queued up a backlog of work that was then, you know, shoveled into the operations centre. It was actually within hours and within seconds of making the request, the payments were stopped on the account. Further down the line, they integrated, you know, the right calculations and business processes into the systems that allowed people to then start talking about actually coming out of furlough. What does affordability look like? And how do we get back onto making our mortgage payments in a way that's affordable for us rather than straight off and on? And again, all straight through processing, all integrated front stage, backstage. And for me, that was the absolute, you know, perfect example of when customer experience, you know, sort of is well orchestrated and really hits the mark.
So Matthew, it's the pandemic what done it.
Well, I was just going to, that does kind of lead nicely onto what I was thinking about, which is when you talk about the experience, we took quite a lot of the examples there have been within what would be coined the retail, so the everyday person, but then where you help businesses to self-service, which then creates far richer experiences for our customers. You think of the days where your bakers would only take cash because that's how they'd done stuff and then have to manually track back their accounting. They've all now got their flexible point of sales, cheap to acquire, linked into their POS, doing their accounting, helping them finance and manage it, helping them run their business better, grow their business better, creating overall better, in this example, bakery experiences, which then means that they don't have to fumble around for coin and cash, and they also don't need to securely then worry about how that's all handling, all that sort of stuff. So it makes it far easier in life for those business owners to focus on what they care about, which quite frankly, amongst us, and don't tell anyone else, no one really cares about banking. Back to the point on how do we elevate to the experience, right? So it's how do you create the experiences that enable people to get on with what they want to do in the right way.
But Fergus, we can talk about these visions and how you can make the whole thing seamless so that we don't really notice that the banking sector has changed in itself. But at the end of the day, what we're talking about is getting people on board on that journey. So the question has to be, how do you make sure that your design is inclusive and it takes into account the considerations of every customer, because their needs will be different?
Yeah, this is again is a great subject and one that every bank that I know of is very, very much involved in wanting to do things better. Now, we all have customer surveys and customer feedback loops, but the regulator is also very useful in this regard in terms of what the FCA require and expect banks to do in terms of inclusion. And I think inclusion is more about a mindset than an actual process. It's if you're building a product or journey for your customers that includes those who may be vulnerable, then you're building it for everybody. So I think it's more mindset than a methodology. Of course, we all have customer feedback loops. We talk to each other. We look to ensure that we're taking into account the broadest demography that we possibly can in building a product. But it's about culture and building it into the culture of the bank that exclusion is out and inclusion is in. And you start at the very beginning of the product with that principle in mind. And I think I've seen, and I'm sure everyone else has, very successful developments of product governance and products for our customers with that philosophy in mind.
Let's move things along now, because Matthew, I want to talk about zero user interface technology. It's a bit of a mouthful, and also voice assistance. But, you know, we hear about this, but what are the deal breakers to doing this well? Certainly picking up on this idea of inclusion. Do it badly, I suppose you alienate your customers.
I guess it's to start with doing it badly is making sure we're doing it for the right purpose. So because technology exists and it's there, should we utilise it for and apply it generally, right? So walking into a room, my TV turns on, that's useful. Now in a banking interface, if I walk in somewhere and it takes payment before I've even done or registered, does that make sense? do I then want to, given a lot of those systems, or from a technology perspective, a lot of it's run on open banking or open source code, have all of my data out there in potentially non-secure or secure environments, depending on what it looks like. What's that balance and trade-off, and how many people do openly want to shout across into their phone they want to make a payment or a transaction? So is the mass appetite there for it yet? I'm not necessarily convinced, but when we get into it and say 5 years time, 10 years time, do you want to have that chat relationship with your phone and bank? Can't see why not. And back to inclusion from sort of an accessibility perspective, there's lots of technology exists today that help people that are visually impaired or in one way or another have cognitive behavioural challenges. Then there is things there that today can service the needs, and there's lots going on in that space to make sure that that is still very well catered for. And now continually using voice or I know you're there, so I'm going to present this information, is how do we make sure that it is right and it is modelled on the right way? Because we know there have been lots of challenges with how some of these models are being developed and what they're basing their data off, and to an extent is junk in, junk out. So if you then start getting that wrong, to that previous point, you do start isolating your customer, and that's something that you really need to be careful on how you implement and roll out at scale, which we've seen with some big, well-known people who have let the AI loose.
Quite literally.
Yeah, I think just to build on that, the two small additions is one. I think err on the side of preferences rather than prediction.
Yeah.
And so when people tell you what they want and how they want to engage, that's safe territory. If you begin to use data to predict what they want and how they want to receive that engagement experience, it's all a bit murkier. And when it comes to banking and finances, and the regulator is also incredibly sensitive. And then when it comes to things like chatbots and AI and other types of technology, where you're sort of moving into advisory-based services that are digitally provided, I think my only advice there would be beware the uncanny valley, which is, as humans, we are super sensitive to authenticity. And so you just need to be completely honest about how this service and engagement is being provided, because ultimately experience is about the memory of that experience, good or bad, and inauthentic experiences will be remembered poorly, I think.
I think that's a fair point, actually. But and against that backdrop, Fergus, I want to talk about the rise of channels. What do you see an omni-channel strategy needing to look like in 5 years' time in view of the uncanny valley and the not so predictive qualities of data? Well, it's pretty good, but when it gets it wrong, boy, does it unleash a howler.
Well, I think that was a bit of a tour de force there by Matt, so it's hard to follow that one. But I think that, going back to my earlier point, I think it will be, a bank in your pocket. So the digital channel will lead out on all of these things in terms of frequency and ease of convenience, etc. I think both the guys to my left mentioned earlier on, I fully agree, there still does need to be human touch. And therefore, branches still do have an important part, for example, in our strategy in Virgin Money, and indeed, I'm sure in every bank strategy. That's where you can load, your brand, your community, the learn about banking, we call it lab, so that you can showcase your products and services to your customer. The branches will be very important in terms of vulnerability and near vulnerability and making sure customers are okay with everything that they need to do and are doing. And then I think a really important channel in support of the digital channel will be what we still call contact centres, but the industrialization of that and moving from contact centre into what we describe as a digital experience centre, where chatbot then moves on to live chat, then moves on to video chat, and then ultimately maybe moves on to face-to-face chat or phone-to-phone chat, depending on the escalation, depending on your IVR, depending on what the customer wants. And that those awful wait times in contact centres that we still experience, particularly with COVID and isolation, and it's been difficult for contact centres, will become much better and much more seamless as the customer moves through the journey I just described there.
Distant memory.
I hope so.
I hope so
That's our plan.
too. But I mean, but Matt, stay with me on this, because look, the idea of actually having this utterly seamless experience so you don't get stuck on a queuing system when you're listening to Greensleeves. How do you think the banks themselves can make that leap to the Opti channel? Because look, there needs to be changes from a technological perspective, but also from a strategy perspective as well. The two have to be fused together somehow towards this ultimate goal.
Yeah, I think that's right. And ultimately, a lot of it will initially be about just getting the basics right. Is that a lot of that information that can drive those more adaptive experiences already exists. We're not talking about data that has to be manufactured or invented. It's already within the operational data of the bank. The challenge is actually making the links between the data that exists and then adapting the experience.
Joining the dots.
And joining the dots, exactly. And so, you know, you really want to get to a world in Opti channel. And I laugh because we've had multi and omni and now we're Opti, and I'm just now wondering what the next one is. But anyway, here we are in an Opti channel future. But we want to get to this place where you can look at the data and say, hey, this customer never calls, and they're calling. So the phone gets picked up immediately by a person and they don't get routed to IVR. Or this person always calls, but they always call after a transaction, in which case we know why they're calling with, you know, huge certainty, and we'll actually respond with the right moment. This isn't impossible now, it's just hard now, because ultimately you've still got to get hold of the data, make the connections, and then wrestle it into some channels and experiences that can adapt and respond to that insight.
Could I build on that if I could for
Yeah.
a moment, please? Just very quickly, that, you know, banks have been on this money curve since the time of the Medicis in Florence, right? You know,
I remember it well.
Indeed, in school. So intermediating between buyers and sellers of money. I think now we're intermediating as well on a data curve, and that there's data there that our customers have given us in trust with proper permissions for us to use, mine that data for their best interests, and that reliability, reusability, and insight from the data to allow what Matt is talking about, I think, is the way some bankers need to think about things, that you're on a money curve and you're on a data curve.
Final question really to close this out. In light of everything that we have discussed, what do you see as the potential hurdles we have to overcome on this quest to have a faster, seamless, invisible customer experience? And once you've identified those hurdles, how do you conquer them? Which is why you, Matthew, will get the first response on that.
I mean, I'm going to build on what we've just been discussing, which is around the data point. And it's not necessarily it's around making it accessible, but also making it timely. Because a lot of the time you can come through and a lot of the banks are still running on batched processes, and therefore you see something, but it's a month, week, day, minute late, and therefore you potentially miss that opportunity. But it also needs to be coined and brought together from we talk Opti channel, we want to intervene and say, hey, are you calling about this? For example, if I call up, why not send a push? But how do you present that information? And then it's getting into a different type of data we're talking about, which is almost the CX data of, well, what are we actually saying, and how do we manage that at scale and distribute it for all the various different instances of which you may want to then go, see your call in, do you want to via this, and just get all the right stuff in place, but then also listen to the feedback, and then if the customer has the same thing again, we know they ignored it, let's just recognise that and go, well, let's respond in a different way and let them come through or go along their merry way of the journey. But in order to enable that, there's a lot that we touched on strategy, is actually how do we have the right focus and ask, because it needs to be a collective journey across all the multiple different, to go back to some old phrases on silos and transactions, and how do you get everyone to work together as a community, because you can't achieve it by yourself. You need the data teams, you need the technology teams, you need the people with the right will and want to then drive that through and make it happen. And it is big and challenging and scary.
Sure. So, but basically, Fergus, shift the thinking in that headspace.
Yeah, and you know, all about the reusability, the accuracy, the real-time nature of the data to be able to deliver an insight, again, as Matt was talking about earlier on, that the customer will find useful. that they say, oh, that's interesting, that's good, you know, there's a special offer, or they're letting me know that my account I need to put some money in, or that my salary has just arrived. Something that's useful for the customer so that we are adding to their daily lives in a positive way.
So avoid the gratuitous overload.
Yes.
Okay, and Matt, final word to you.
Yeah, I mean, without wanting to sort of overly simplify, I mean, ultimately, you know, when it comes to data, there's things I know about me, and I know you know about me, and that's probably okay to use. Then there's things I know about me that you don't know about me, and that's probably deliberate. So don't go and get it from third-party sources and start using it. Then there's things that you know about me that I don't know about myself, because ultimately I look like a number of cohorts, and you're running your analytics against all of this transaction data, so you can divine these things. Yeah, that's probably a bit shifty to use as well. And so navigating these types of pools of data is going to be the kind of the needle that needs to be threaded by the banks to drive these experiences that feel more authentic and customer-centric than perhaps they are now. And the only thing that I would probably add right at the end is that, you know, concentrating on the data and customer data strategy is more important in my mind than customer journeys. And so, you know, customer journeys is the current market obsession. Everything is journey-centric. But ultimately, fast forward in 5, 6, 7 years, customer journeys won't exist. And they'll all be journeys that are driven by the data. And so we need to be laying the foundations of that future data-driven engagement model and preparing for the demise of those customer journeys, you know, now.
Okay, a sound note on which to end. Gentlemen, thank you so much for joining us. I mean, you've really mapped out a fantastic future, an intriguing future, especially with the data and how much we should know or how much should be withheld. That's scary. But I'm not going to be afraid. But look, we've had a really fascinating discussion on how banks can create a proactive, seamless and customer-led journey. And all that remains for me to say is thank you so much for being with us. And of course, we look forward to seeing you again very soon.